Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone joining us from different parts of the world today. Bonjour de Montréal. My name is Liz Bernhardt, Head of Communications at the Convention on Biological Diversity, and I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to all of you and to thank all journalists and media partners for taking the time to be here with us today. Your reporting helps to demystify complex negotiations and brings these issues to a global audience. It makes our topics accessible while highlighting both the progress being made and the challenges that remain on the path toward achieving sustainability for our planet and for our people. We've convened this media briefing ahead of two upcoming meetings. One is the subsidiary body on scientific, technical, and technological advice, known as SBSTTA 27. And the other is the first meeting of the subsidiary body on Article 8J, both of which will be hosted by the government of Panama in October. Very soon, I will hand over to our Executive Secretary, Ms. Astrid Schomaker, to help set the scene for these meetings and how they form part of the road towards our 17th Conference of the Parties, COP17, happening in October 2026 in Yerevan, Armenia. And I'm also pleased that we can be joined by my colleagues, Sakile Silichena, here in person, and Olivier Rakundo, later online, who are Secretariat focal points of SBSTTA 27 and SBHJ, respectively, to provide some context on these meetings. Together, we'll outline for you some of the main issues on the agenda, explain what's at stake for biodiversity and how governments, Indigenous peoples, and local communities will be working together to advance progress. We're also joined by Gillian Campbell, Head of Monitoring, Review, and National Reporting, in case there are specific questions on the Global Review and national reports. Just first, before we begin, a few housekeeping reminders for everyone. Firstly, only panelists' microphones will be unmuted during today's briefing. A recording and transcript of today's call will be made available shortly after the event at a URL that's emailed to you. And for all those who want to pose questions in today's briefing, please start posting them directly here in the Zoom chat to our colleague Terry Collins at any time. And in a little bit, I'll moderate our responses, and we'll try to get to all questions in today's briefing. For Spanish-speaking journalists, our colleague Fabiana will translate your questions for the panelists and interpret the responses back into Spanish for you into the chat. This might take a minute or two, so please do have patience with us in this process. And when posing questions through the chat, please identify your news outlet when you post them to Terry. Let me now proceed to why we're all here. We're honored today to be joined by our Executive Secretary, Astrid Schomaker, as well as our colleagues online and in person, who will provide an overview of the upcoming meetings. I'll now turn it over to Astrid to begin with opening remarks.
So thank you, Liz, and good day, everybody. And we know there's a lot to distract you happening on the global scene, so we really appreciate that you've taken the time to join us for this briefing. The biodiversity crisis, as you know, because many of you have followed our work, is one that threatens the intricate web of biodiversity, and as such, obviously, threatens our survival as humans on the planet, threatens our life support systems, threatens our economies, our health, our well-being. So it is a crisis that is well worth your attention. And as the other Rio conventions do as well, we have a complex process that leads us to our COPs that take place every 2 years. Liz has already said the next one will be in Yerevan in October next year. And as the first of the big preparatory meetings, we have the 2 meetings that she has announced in Panama in just a few weeks. One of the highlights of the discussions in Panama will be our first global review of progress in the implementation of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. And as you know, that is the world's blueprint for halting and reversing biodiversity loss and living in harmony with nature. The COP17 can build on a very successful COP16. Some of you may have been in Cali. This was a COP that saw a massive mobilization of people. It was called the COP de la Gente, and that took a few groundbreaking decisions, such as an innovative new financing mechanism, the Cali Fund. It took a really big step to enhance the role, standing, and possibility to contribute of Indigenous people and local communities. And it also took a very important decision on climate change and biodiversity and how these things interlink, amongst many other discussions. So we have a lot to build on in this process towards COP17. And let me maybe also highlight that we're really grateful to the government of Panama for hosting these meetings. And let me say that they've also been hosting a meeting of the Climate Convention, and after us, they will be hosting a meeting of the Desertification Convention, the UNCCD. And that speaks to the commitment of Panama to see the work of these Rio conventions in synergy. And that was very much in turn on the agenda of last week's meetings in New York at UNGA during the UN80 discussions, and of course also during UN Climate Week. So a lot of support for the Rio conventions to work together. And as such, the discussions that we will be having at our preparatory meeting are also relevant for COP30 in Belém than just a few weeks later. Maybe I should highlight in particular, as I've started to do at the outset, the global review process. You know that we have an ambitious set of targets for 2030. They're action-oriented, many of them are quantified. We only had 8 years from the end of 2022 when they were adopted to 2030, so that's been a tall order from the beginning. And I think we're not telling you a secret when we say that progress towards those targets in our perception has not been linear. So the order of the day for COP17 will certainly be acceleration. But where to accelerate and what are really the difficult points where parties may need more support, when we need to build new communities of practice, bring actors together, that is what the global review will tell us. And we will hear more about it in a little bit. But for us, it is important, again, to build on COP16, which brought together so many people, and to bring together in Yerevan as well these many, many actors that not only have a stake in biodiversity, but with their commitments can really take us a big step forward. But for all of that to happen, we need you. We need the media. We need you to support us, get the story out, and also explain and demystify, as Liz has been saying, a little bit the biodiversity agenda. So we're grateful that you're here. We look forward to working together with you, and we will always be available should you have questions to ask. With that, I hand over to Liz. Take us through the rest of the program.
Thank you so much, Astrid. It's a pleasure now to hand over to my colleague Sekile for remarks on SBSTTA 27, a bit about its relevance and items on the agenda. So Sekile, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Liz. So just for our colleagues in the press, you'll hear us referring to SBSTTA a lot, and it's the way we have used the abbreviation for the subsidiary body. So SBSTTA 27, which is the 27th meeting of the subsidiary body, will address key scientific and technical aspects that relate to the implementation of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, progress towards achieving the targets, and as Astrid has already said, where the gaps are. As she has already said, and as Liz also outlined, the report on global progress in implementing the framework, this is one of the key items that is going to be discussed at the meeting in Panama. And we hope that it will provide us with a basis for the review to take place at COP17 and provide us with the directions that we need to go scientifically, technically, but also for implementation. In support of this, but also in support of parties' implementation of the framework, we're going to be reviewing the policy recommendations that come out of, or the policy implications of the new assessments by the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, which we abbreviate as IPBES. And those are the Nexus assessment and the transformative change assessment. And SBSTTA will promote the uptake of these assessments. In addition to that, there's a whole raft of other agenda items, not a raft. A set of scientific items that we'll be talking about. Advancing coherent approaches to addressing issues that are relevant for the framework, the objectives of the convention, and also the protocols. So these include the linkages between biodiversity and climate change, biodiversity and health linkages, invasive alien species, biodiversity and agriculture, a review and adjustment of programs of work under the convention to make them more relevant for the framework, and also issues relating to biosafety. And so this is what we're looking forward to in Panama, and we hope you will join us and help us to communicate the outcomes. Back to you, Liz.
Thank you, Sakile. I like the raft analogy. It's like a lifeboat, biodiversity for our planet. I will provide a little bit of an introduction on the SBHJ meetings while our colleagues Olivier Rukundo and Kepak Conde join us later on in this briefing. So let me provide just some opening context for the second meeting that's happening in Panama next month. This is going to be the first meeting of the new subsidiary body on Article 8J and other provisions of the Convention on Biological Diversity related to Indigenous peoples and local communities. SB8J meeting number 1 is historic. No UN environmental treaty has ever created a permanent body dedicated to Indigenous peoples and local communities. Items on the agenda include consideration of the rules of procedure and governance for the new body, including modalities for the participation of Indigenous peoples and local communities in the governance structure of the SB8J. The agenda will also consider guidelines to strengthen the legal and policy framework for the recognition of the role of Indigenous and traditional territories of Indigenous peoples and local communities in spatial planning, restoration, and conservation. It will consider advice on integrating traditional knowledge into the Global Process Report on the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, the KMGBF implementation. And it will consider in-depth dialogue with a focus on access to funding for Indigenous peoples and local communities and on resource mobilization. And we'll be able to answer questions on both of those meetings in the meeting today. Thank you so much for the opening remarks. We will now open up to questions from the journalists. Please do post these in the chat directly to Terry Collins if you haven't done so already, and we'll get to them one by one. I will read out those questions here in this forum in the Zoom call and then hand over to one of my colleagues for response. Let me just see if we have any questions in the chat. All right, and Kepak has joined us, our colleague working on this DHA. Thank you so much. Let me start us off then with a few questions just to give a bit of the bigger picture. Astrid, if I could just ask you, with COP30 on climate coming up just a few weeks later, and you mentioned that they're strongly linked, how do you see the biodiversity and climate agendas working hand in hand?
Well, thanks. That's a question we get all the time. So I'm not surprised you wanted to kick us off with that. Well, I think for scientists, it is very clear, and increasingly it's also clear to everybody who's just, observing nature and observing the climate, is that the climate and biodiversity crisis are, in fact, as we like to say, two sides of the same coin. So they're absolutely intrinsically linked. So climate change is one of the main drivers of biodiversity loss, making biodiversity loss worse. In other words, and at the same time, the fact that our ecosystems are in such a dire state means they cannot do the ecosystem services that climate needs. So the climate regulation that forests provide, or that the healthy ocean can provide, they can only provide if these ecosystems are in good shape. So that is how they are linked. And that means that for many people, And here, of course, it's very interesting to see the worldview of the indigenous peoples that have for centuries, obviously, or millennia, looked at these climate and nature issues together and have come forward with more holistic responses, that we also as global community try and develop holistic responses. That means for a climate agenda, looking very much at nature-based solutions or nature-based solutions, ecosystem-based approaches, so to see what nature can do to help in the fight against climate, because it's clear for everybody working in the UNFCCC context that with the energy transition itself, crucial as it is, we will not be able to get climate change under control and certainly not even get close to the 1.5 target. So we need nature as our ally in that fight. And the parties to the Biodiversity Convention have also recognized that they've put a specific target into the Global Biodiversity Framework on climate. And we are, of course, now working very closely with the Brazilian presidency, with our Colombian presidency, to see whether within the Climate Convention context, so in Willamette COP30, this recognition of the role of nature, which will be obvious because it's a COP in the forest and it's a nature COP in many ways, can translate itself also in the COP30 discussions into a clear mandate for our colleagues in the UNFCCC Secretariat to pursue these synergies more actively. And by that, I mean that the secretariats coordinate, that parties make greater efforts to bring national planning processes together, but if they do so, that if and when they do so, that they're also supported through finance and through capacity building, joint programs, ideally from the conventions. So there's a lot more to that, but I finish here.
Thank you so much, Astrid. We have a question from Orla Dwyer from Carbon Brief, and she's wondering what exactly will be discussed about the global review at the Panama meetings. Will early assessments on progress be made, or will discussions focus on the logistics of the review? Also, will these be the last major meetings held before COP17? I could answer the last question to say that these are not the last major meetings held before COP17. We will have the subsidiary body on implementation meetings happening in February, and we will have another meeting of the SBSTTA happening in late end of July, early August. And so those will all form stepping stones towards COP17. If I'm missing any meetings, please do let me know.
Well, we are missing many meetings,
But,
in the
it's
sense
really-
that we're organizing a lot of
Yeah.
local and regional workshops to get people ready for the global review, which should rely in its majority and to the biggest extent on national reports that are due by the end of February. So we're very, very keen to get countries alerted and speed up their reporting processes so that we have the reports in time for them to feed into the global review. That also answers your question in a sense, because we are still in this process of getting ready or asking parties to get ready with their reports, that the meeting in Panama will not yet discuss substance, it will mostly discuss process. But before I hand over to Julian, who can explain that better, I just want to say that it is really important that parties do get their reports done. It is also important that the gap we see in implementation, and to date, I believe we only have 57 countries that have submitted their national strategies and action plans for how they want to implement the GBF, that this also happens and accelerates if we want to have a chance to meet our targets. But Julian, do you want to say more about the process?
Yeah, so I'll just say that it is true that we will be looking at the annotated outline for the global report, which is what will be discussed at SBSTTA, which sets the stage for the structure of the report that's going to be produced. And this, of course, feeds into the review. I wanted to mention that the SBI agenda, which is the meeting that's coming up in February, will be where we provide an update of the progress towards the submission of NBSAPs and the national targets. However, we do have the analysis as of now, which is ready and will be shared as an information document for SBSTTA. So if you want to see an idea of what's included in the 140 national target submissions that we have, so 140 countries have submitted national targets, this will be released hopefully this week, but definitely soon as an information paper. And then this will be discussed more formally at the SBI meeting, which of course is our body on implementation. And then you ask, will there be other meetings? So the main time where the report will be discussed will be at the next SBSTTA, which is going to be in July of 2026. And this will be the time where the substance of the report is really discussed. And SBI will be the opportunity to discuss the implications of that scientific report for the decision-making under the convention. And so SBSTTA 28 and SBI 7 will be the opportunity to really discuss the outcomes of the global review ahead of COP 17. And so I think that hopefully that helps with the process. There will also be a peer review of this information, which will happen next year. And I did want to mention quickly that the global report will also be discussed at SB8J to some extent, because 8J has been tasked with looking at the traditional knowledge inputs for the global report. And so this is also on the agenda there.
Thank you so much, Jillian, for the comprehensive answer. I think we answered all parts of the comprehensive question. Thank you so much. So Keela, while we're waiting for another question, if you wouldn't mind, if I could just ask you, what role do you see science and technology playing in understanding biodiversity and meeting global commitments in the KMGBF?
Thank you, Liz. So the convention is a convention that uses science. So we use science to direct policy decisions. And basically what we look to the science to tell us is what is the status of biodiversity, what are the trends in biodiversity, what are the threats, and what are the impacts if those threats are realized. Science also tells us what processes lie behind those, the status, the trends, the threats, the impacts. Science tells us how those processes are interlinked, and science tells us what can we do to address those processes. Science also can help us, and technology can help us in creating solutions to address the challenges that we identify, and also hopefully can also tell us how to prioritize our efforts at a global level. And so we are in a continuous process in the convention, and with the protocols as well, to use science to try to help us to make the best possible decision based on the options in front of us.
Thank you, Sakila. We have another question from Stella Paul from IPS News. This says questions primarily to Astrid, but others can chime in as well. Which areas do you think will be the most intense discussions in this SBSTTA? Will Cali Fund be discussed here? If yes, how? And what can we expect related to gene drive technology, which was prominently discussed in Nairobi at SBSTTA 2024? We don't have our DSI and Cali Fund colleagues in the call with us today. Of course, if there's any questions we can't fully answer today, we're happy to have you reach out so we can provide further answers. But to the question about which areas we think will be most intensively discussed at SBSTTA, do we have a response to that?
It's always difficult to guess in advance, and there hasn't been a COP that hasn't been a surprise to some extent. But maybe three, I would think. Well, first of all, I think the issues around the global review and how this will shape up, I think, will be a subject of intense discussion, simply because it is so important, and because everybody understands, parties and stakeholders, that we're not on track towards the 2030 targets. So how that is being communicated and what might be then the outcome of COP17. So how can we make sure that against the background of targets across the board, likely lagging behind, including financing targets, I think will be a very, very important discussion. The second point that I believe will be discussed a lot, also because the Belém COP30 comes just on the heels of our subsidiary bodies, is the linkages between climate change and biodiversity. And We have already discussed that. I mean, the subject and the needs for synergies on substance, I think, is clear. The procedural issues around that, so how to do it, probably will have gotten an extra boost from the UN-80 discussions around efficiencies throughout the UN system. So I would expect there to be a lot of discussion. We have, for example, a very ambitious host country, Panama, that has just submitted its nature pledge, which is a new way of looking at the national planning processes under the 3 Rio Conventions and putting them together in one document. And that is certainly, for many parties, the way they think they should go. And I think there will be a lot of discussions around it. The third issue, not directly on the agenda, but very, very important, as some of you may recall, we ran out of time in Cali for our discussion. So everything related to efficiency of meetings is very, very important. And we are very happy that at the SBSTTA meeting, we are piloting a new approach that would hopefully allow us to save some time on the first that we normally spend on first readings. And that is an entirely voluntary approach. It will not create a precedent as such, but it will be a useful experience when we come back to these discussions at the subsidiary body on implementation in February next year. So everybody understands that our agendas keep growing, but the time available for our meetings, unfortunately, does not. So we have to come up with new ways of maybe doing things differently. We as CBD Secretariat have tried to make our contribution by not only making a major effort to get the documents out in time, which we manage, but also to make the documents shorter. So, and the recommendations may be a bit more focused. So everybody has to come together around the discussion, but it will be an important one as well.
Thank you so much, Astrid. I would love to remind people, ask to please do continue. Was there anything else?
Sorry, I forgot you had the question on the Cali Fund. No, so the Cali Fund as such will not be on the agenda of the meetings, but which doesn't mean there's nothing happening on the Cali Fund. So maybe just to recall, it was operationalized in Cali, hence the name. We opened it in the margins of COP16 in Rome. So the Cali Fund is open for business, open for contributions by companies. And we are now in the process to make sure that what we call the rule book is fully in place, so that when companies start paying into the fund, they have clarity how those funds will be administered. And for that, it is the steering committee of the Cali Fund that is working on this documentation. It has just met earlier this month in person in Bonn for very good discussions, and it will meet again at least one more time in person before COP17. And then there are 2 streams of work that need to be done, need to be completed for COP17 to take a decision on the Cali Fund, and that relates to the allocation methodology. So if you recall, this is not a project-based disbursement, but a disbursement on the basis of a set of criteria that have to be turned into methodology related to the richness of biodiversity that a country has. But then also the second issue, and that is very important for companies, of course, and that is the contribution rates. So as you know, we have indicative rates in the Cali Fund decision, which many think is the minimum rate. Some companies say is absolutely way too high. So there needs to be a discussion around that as well, and that will come to a close, we expect, at COP17.
Thank you, Astrid. There was a question about what can we expect related to gene drive technology, which was prominently discussed in Nairobi at SBSTTA 2024. And I do not know if that is specifically on the agenda.
No, it's not on the agenda. No.
Thank you. While we wait for additional questions, please do continue posting them to Terry in the chat. I'd also like to note that we have some links that have been posted for you in the chat already. One of them is the media registration for our upcoming meetings. All meeting documents are also now in the chat for you. And there is a link where you will find the Zoom recording and the transcript. Those will follow very soon after this call. So they will be available at this link, and we'll also send that out by email. I'd like to welcome our colleague Kepak Kande, who has joined us online, and just to check if Kepak can hear us.
Yes, I can hear you.
Hello, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us. Kepak, we have, as you know, the upcoming first meeting of the SBSTTA, and I'd like to ask if you might like to say a word for us on why you feel it's significant. Why is it significant that Indigenous peoples now have a permanent place in CBD decision-making? And what difference do you expect this will make?
Yes, thank you. Good morning, colleagues, and thank you for the question. Yes, this is the first meeting of the subsidiary body. It's very historic in a sense that it is a transition from the working group on Article AJ, who worked for around 20 years, and now to a permanent body which will address issues related to traditional knowledge and the contribution of Indigenous people and local communities in conservation. Yes, the program of work of Article AJ provides the mandate to the subsidiary body to address several tasks, but in this occasion, it was identified by the COP Bureau that this session in particular needs to address the task 1.1, 1.2 that are to develop, and the task aims to develop guidelines to support the implementation of Target 1, 2, and 3 of the Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. This is one of the key elements, as you know, because the rapid implementation of the Montreal Framework, in particular Target 3, it's one of the elements that Indigenous people regarding area-based conservation aim to support. So we see that this is one of the key agenda items. A second key agenda item for the first session is the modus operandi. This is how the body will govern itself, well, with the rules of procedures of the body. And a key question is keeping a balance between a party-led process, but at the same time ensuring that the mechanisms established in the working group for participation of Indigenous people and local communities will still continue. That's the main balance that the modus operandi needs to achieve. Again, this is a very historic meeting because it shows these transitions from the working group to a permanent body where issues related to traditional knowledge could support the implementation of the convention and the framework. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We're all very excited for that meeting happening next month. I don't see more questions from the journalists. I do have one other question I'd like to ask us to consider and think about while our online colleagues consider whether they'd like to ask us one more question before we start to wrap up. But one question I'd like to know, and I think Sakile and Astrid would be well placed to respond, but I see you looking over at me here, waiting for this question. But one thing I'd love to know, and I think a lot of people that look at our processes and look at the KMGBF want to know how it connects to issues that people feel in their daily lives, like food prices, health, or extreme weather. And I was wondering if one or either or both of you might have some thoughts on how you feel the KMGBF helps to address these daily issues for people around the world.
We're looking at each other.
I can start off, and maybe Astrid can provide like a more global overview. So I think that we need to the GBF, yes, but maybe take it a step back and think about what is biodiversity, what is this thing that we're talking about, and how does it underpin everything. So when you think about biodiversity, a lot of people think about it as this abstract concept. But if we reduce it down to its basics, it's about genes and the diversity in the genes. It's about species, so wild species, but also domesticated species, and the diversity around those species. And then it's about ecosystems and landscapes, right? So anything that happens to impact genes, species, landscapes, ecosystems will have an impact on the lives of people, because that's the basis for life. If you think about food production, for example, a lot of the foods that we eat are based on genetic and species diversity and the health of those genes and species. And so anything like weather shocks will impact the production of food, will impact food prices. If you think, for example, anything that impacts the balance in ecosystems will, for example, impact biodiversity, and then will impact, as a knock-on effect, people's health. We saw that with the pandemic, the flow of genes between the wild and food markets, and therefore through food markets, through labs, and through into people's lives. And so it is about not only the genes, not only the species, not only the ecosystems, but how they interrelate, and then the balance that we maintain among and between them. And so if I then come back to the question that you were asking, how then does the GBF contribute to this? So the framework is a global response by 196 parties to the crisis, the biodiversity crisis, and helping countries to frame a response to the crisis. And not only the 23 targets, but the other elements of the framework. So for example, we have in section C, a response on One Health, for example. How do you link biodiversity and health? We have responses relating to productive landscapes, like food production on agricultural lands, for example. So this is how the framework responds to those everyday issues. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Sakila. Any additional thoughts from?
No, not really, but I think, Zaki, I'm very happy that you focused on food systems in particular, because of course land use change is one of the big drivers. I think it's actually the biggest driver in most parts of the world of biodiversity loss, but also of climate change. So it is really important that the food system as a whole comes into focus of global discussions in all Rio conventions. And hence, maybe also not surprising that when the executive secretaries of the 3 Rio conventions met recently, we said we would really love to work together around this issue of food systems and see how we can better support our parties, notably in the sort of integrated spatial planning decisions they very often have to make, where it is important that if you look at a piece of land, you consider it not just, for example, from the perspective of climate change, where you might want to use this land for monoculture in order to quickly absorb carbon, or where you may just want to use it for any other kind of renewable energy, but you would also look at it from a biodiversity perspective and try and find the kind of solutions that would work for both agendas. So that makes it very important. The other thing about food systems is, of course, these are the kind of issues that need global responses, because I mean, a lot of the food that is produced, including and in particular in the global south, is being produced for consumption in the global north. So it is in a way unfair to just sort of leave the responsibility to one part of that entire chain and that entire system. Rather, what is needed is the kind of systems approach that looks at everybody's role, including the roles of the middlemen and the retailers, etc. So these kind of debates are some that need to come to the fore much more. And then linking it again to the extreme weather events that you mentioned, and I conclude with that, the fact that our food systems have developed in a way to monocultures in many parts of the world, and that the majority of our nourishment now relies on, I think, 6, 8, or 10 crops worldwide, makes us and makes food systems, but therefore also humanity, extremely vulnerable to these shocks, because these, let's say, non-diverse food systems or production systems are not well equipped to react to any kind of say climate shocks adversity, etc. That's why we need biodiversity as underpinning food security. And I think that is interestingly now really an issue that brings together the UN system as a whole. I've mentioned the Rio Conventions, of course, other conventions such as Ramsar, which we talk about wetlands would be very important, but also the FAO with its focus on food has been very, very clear in saying that biodiversity underpins food security. So there's a lot of work happening in that space. And I think also a lot of discussion still necessary, so this doesn't become a finger-pointing exercise at farmers, but a systems discussion and to see how we can fix this.
Thank you both. You've really outlined how food systems and food security is really at the heart of this crisis, the triple crisis of climate change, biodiversity loss, and desertification, land degradation. Those are the three Rio Convention topics. But also it seems like reforming those systems is a big part of the solution as well.
And pollution, because a lot of the pollution that we experience comes from chemical, the use of chemicals for agriculture, be it as fertilizers or be it as pesticides. So that is also something that we need to address, and that brings, of course, then in a whole other set of conventions that will also help us on that. But yeah, so it's really an effort of all hands on deck. But where I think it's good to see people coming together, but also where there's really a long way to go.
Thank you both. We should also mention that the upcoming IFBES business assessment that will be approved in February will demonstrate that every business is dependent to a lesser or greater extent on biodiversity, not just the traditional ones where it's quite obvious, like agriculture, but every business. So do keep your eyes out for information coming out for the IFBES business report in the coming months. We have a question from Julio Vivas at Agencia EFA. And Julio's question is, how do you explain the importance of these meetings to people who may never have heard of the CBD? Who would like to take this question?
Well, I think we just started to do it. So I would say the majority of people around the world have never heard of CBD. And when they hear CBD, they may be thinking of other things than the conventional biological diversity. So we understand that that is an issue for us. We also understand that the term biodiversity as such is not a term that is well understood. Nature resonates a bit better. So I think the question is absolutely valid, but again, it is actually something on which we also rely on the media to help us to explain the kind of relevance of nature and the healthy nature for well-being, for our economies, for medicines, for flood prevention, for all the ecosystem services they offer. So I think again, that is something on which we all need to work together. Its complexity is never easily explained, but on the other hand, I think, if you look around yourself, people see increasingly what it means when biodiversity is not in a good shape for themselves. I think everybody, and we saw that of course very strongly after COVID, but we see it now with the majority of people moving to cities, living in urban scapes, that how much they cherish a little bit of nature, be it a park, be it an urban forest, or something like that. So this connection with nature, or the need to reconnect with nature, we believe people feel increasingly. And then lastly, and I think that's a very, very important development, for many years, we had the business sector really not particularly interested in biodiversity and the work in our convention. So they were focused on climate and were sort of thinking, okay, we fix our emissions and then we're good. And I would think maybe over the past 5 years in particular, since the adoption of the Global Biodiversity Framework, in particular, business has developed a much, much greater interest. This is being helped again by science. So the Intergovernmental Panel for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services that my colleague Sakila has already mentioned a while ago did a very good assessment looking or coming out with very interesting figures on how business relies on ecosystems, on healthy nature. And that is figures that keep being repeated by everybody, including the World Economic Forum and others, whereby it becomes very clear that business activity in all sectors is underpinned to a large degree by nature. And WEF talks about a 44 trillion economy that is at stake. So if you look at the global risk reports, you see business being very, very worried when they're looking at the next 10 years. The loss of biodiversity and of ecosystem services ranks among the top 3. So that is a great concern. So business is now sort of coming to a table as an actor, wanting to understand better its own dependencies and the risks it faces, but also wanting to see what are the investment opportunities. And that is for us an area in which we need to work a lot more to make sure that investing in nature is really seen and understood as a very profitable investment, that we can work with governments and others to make sure that where this is sometimes felt to be too risky, that we can have private-public partnerships to help de-risk such investment. But overall, the figures we have is that investing in nature yields incredibly high benefits and high yields. So it is a very worthwhile thing. And of course, in our framework, there is a target for disclosure. So companies are moving forward with disclosing, with analyzing and disclosing their impacts. And that will then have an effect. Shareholders will look at that. The finance sector will look at that. And if you have businesses that are clearly pursuing unsustainable business models, I think we can see over time a reaction from the financial sector and the de-investment going forward. Thanks.
Thank you, Astrid. You've brought up the very important point of business case for biodiversity and the returns on that investment. Julio, I think your question also is incredibly important from a communications, education, and public awareness perspective. And we are working on a global plan of action, which we'll be presenting next summer for consideration before the COP on how to get biodiversity into curricula worldwide at all levels, how to really get information out through public awareness. It's incredibly important. And I think one of the cases we have to make is that the real impacts that happen when you lose biodiversity. Human health is impacted, the quality of air that we're breathing, the quality of water that we're drinking, the food that we're eating, all of that is impacted. There are very real impacts from the loss of biodiversity. On a side note, recently I read that when a word has more than 3 syllables, sadly, the comprehension of the general public falls precipitously. So any word more than 3 syllables, you lose a lot of people in the understanding. So biodiversity itself has a bit of a challenge, but I do think that words like nature or concepts like web of life, maybe there are other ways that we can, nature-based solutions, maybe ways that we can communicate while we don't lose the complexity and the science-based nature of our topics, communicating to different audiences so that the concepts are understood. I think we need to think about how we're talking about biodiversity loss. And I also very much think we need to talk about solutions, resilience, and pathways towards a hopeful future, right? As well as the real crisis that we are also experiencing. We do have a final question, which I will get to before we start to wrap up this media briefing. Elisabetta Cora, and I believe that's from Carbon Brief. Please correct me if I'm wrong. The question is, what about the connectivity among protected areas, which is a main target of the Montreal Kunming Biodiversity Framework? Are we on track with connectivity, and where has progress been detected?
Thank you very much. Yes, we will be talking specifically what the CBD parties will be discussing, protected areas, connectivity, protected and conserved areas, specifically at the next meeting of the SBSTTA in Nairobi next year, and hopefully unpacking a lot more on that. And Jillian has been doing a lot of work with her team on assessing where countries in their self-reporting are with regards to connectivity. But thank you for picking up something that is an actual key issue. So target 3 is a famous target because everybody likes the 30 by 30, reaching 30% by 2030. And a lot of attention is based on the numerical, the quantitative level. Whereas we are struggling, for example, with the non-quantitative elements of that target, which are, for example, relating to effectiveness of protected areas, where we are looking at connectivity and where we are looking at protecting and conserving areas which are important for biodiversity and ecosystem services, so such as climate change, for adaptation, for mitigation, for food production, food systems. And so connectivity as such is an issue that in our work, we've been trying to promote, we've been trying to support parties in their work towards that when thinking about setting targets relating to Target 3. Unfortunately, connectivity is, when we talk to our parties, the countries, on a day-to-day basis, connectivity is an issue that is difficult for countries to grasp, because you're talking about issues relating to the management of landscapes. We have diverse landscapes out there. We have already rights, land rights. We have already land uses, as we have already spoken about, and we have already plans for those. And so when we talk about connectivity, this is where Target 1 of the framework comes in, and this is where we need to start pushing, because biodiversity inclusive spatial planning will help us move towards more connected landscapes. Yeah, so all of that to say is we are seeing countries struggle with connectivity, but we are hoping that the renewed guidance on protected areas at the next SBSTA will help move us forward and help to translate the results that Julian and her team will help us to translate that into accelerated action towards 2030.
Thank you so much, Sakila. I understand from Jillian that around or a little bit less than half of the parties actually have targets addressing the connectedness of protected areas and the protection of particularly important areas, as well as the representativeness of protected areas. Anything you'd like to add on the connectedness?
Not half parties, half of country parties who have submitted Target 3.
Okay.
So, yes.
So less than that.
Yes, because there's about 50 parties who haven't submitted national targets yet, so they're not, we don't know what they will commit to.
So around 125 parties have submitted
For Target 3,
for Target
yes.
3. Mhm.
Exactly, 125.
Great. I have to apologize because that question came from Elisabetta, who is from the Huffington Post. I misidentified you. Apologies, Elisabetta. I will take one final question. We just checking in the chat. Okay, last question from our journalists today, and I want to thank everyone for your questions. Ashley Brown, freelance journalist for the Smithsonian Magazine, has a question. I think, Kipak, this will be addressed to you. As Indigenous and local communities work to continue or reestablish their traditional practices and protect biodiversity, how will this UN process connect back to them on a practical level? Would you like to say a word on that? You're muted, Kipak, sorry. Yes.
Now you can hear me. Thank you. Yes, thanks for the question. Yes, well, actually, one of the characteristics of the working group on Article 8J is that it's able to connect what are the voices on the ground with the international level. One significant element to do that, it's among the different mechanisms established within the CBD to ensure their voices at the international level is the voluntary fund. And through the voluntary fund and also as well in Indigenous people, local communities, also finding their own funding, there is a strong presence of them in the meeting as such. So what is interesting here is how they could provide this on the ground basis experiences, stories, traditional knowledge that could fit into international policy about biodiversity. And I think the most practical element on that is that then they themselves know that they are able to sit in a table, in the SBAJ table with governments, and making sure that their rights, their interests, their aspirations are heard and fit and guide the development of these policies. Very briefly, what a practical outcome of the SBAJ, its aim, it's the development of these guidelines as sort of mentioned here. Indigenous corridors. Indigenous territories serve as ecological corridors that are places between, around, and in protected areas. The program of work under the task 1.1, 1.2 aims to develop these guidelines to provide legal frameworks for indigenous territories and how this could contribute to spatial planning and better integrated in the broader implementation of Target 3. I think the big picture and how those practical elements work is because they are able to provide their voices in these tools such as these guidelines, then they could go back and at the implementation level, and they could make sure that their rights, their aspirations are reflected there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Capac. And I'd like to thank all of our speakers, Astrid, Sakila, Jillian, Capac, for setting the scene and sharing their perspectives on these key issues that are ahead of us. I'd like to thank everyone who's joined the call today for your interest and all of your insightful questions. And just as a reminder, before we wrap up, SBSTA 27 will be held from October 20th to 24th. SBAJ1 will be held from October 27th to 30th. A recording of today's briefing and a transcript will be made available shortly after the call. The link was sent to you in the chat and will be sent by email as well. If anyone would like to book an interview with us, with our executive secretary, please do contact our colleague, Franca. You'll find her email address in the chat. You were also in touch with her today for the briefing, and we will be able to respond to you to arrange that. We will have the plenary sessions of the upcoming meetings will be live streamed on UN Web TV. All sessions are from 10 a.m. to 1 p.m. and from 3 to 6 p.m. every day. We also encourage you to follow updates and resources on the official CBD web and social media channels to stay informed about the discussions and their outcomes. And we'll drop those links into the chat for you as well. Thank you again, everyone, for your participation, your engagement, and your continued role in helping us tell the story of life on Earth. It really helps to bring these important biodiversity issues to a wider audience and ensures that the public understands the significance of our processes at the UN, including these upcoming meetings in Panama. With that, we will officially close today's press briefing. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.